Everybody, I want to talk to you guys about a horrific massacre that took place in the year 1822 called the Chios Massacre. And I want to tie this massacre in with some of the other things that were happening in the geopolitical atmosphere at the time. And I want to connect that with some of the things that are taking place in our own time. So in the year 1822, the Ottoman Empire butchered 25,000 people on the island of Chios. Why? Well, the Greeks were in the midst of a war for independence against Ottoman rule, and a number of Greek fighters had entered the island of Chios trying to convince the people to join the war for independence. A small minority of people on the island had joined the revolution for independence, but the great majority of the inhabitants of Chios had refused to participate in the war. Nonetheless, the small presence of rebels on the island was enough to piss off the Ottomans. It was enough to enrage the Ottomans, who saw this as an opportunity to orchestrate a massacre. And massacre they did. The policy was that if you were a male 12 years or above, you were to be killed. If you were a woman aged 40 and above, you were also to be killed. And the Turks butchered 25,000 people. They enslaved 45,000, and they drove out 10 to 20,000 people. The British were watching the entire time. They had a naval ship circling the island the whole time, watching as these people were being butchered. There were Greek ships around the island, and they were begging the British Navy for help. And you know what the British said? The British said, "Sorry, we can't help because we need to maintain our key strategic alliance with Turkey. We need to maintain our key strategic alliance with a very important ally." And so they watched as these people were butchered. They ignored their cries for help. They didn't give a damn. It reminds me of the massacre of Smyrna, in which Turkish forces butchered thousands of ethnic Greeks in the coastal city of Smyrna. The Americans were watching the entire time and didn't do a damn thing about it. Why? Same thing. We need to maintain our key strategic alliance. And what is so important about this alliance? The Americans and the British have always seen the Turks as a key strategic ally against Russia, because the Anglosphere would rather have the Turks control the Black Sea and control the Balkans than the Russians. It doesn't matter how genocidal the Turks can be. Doesn't matter how genocidal they have been. The Anglosphere, the Americans and the British and the French, would rather have the Turks control the Balkans than the Russians. If that means watching an entire island getting butchered and enslaved, then so be it. This is the mentality of the American Empire, of the Anglosphere. Now fast forward to the year 1853, when the Russians declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The British did not hesitate to join the war against the Russians. Hundreds of thousands of Ottoman and French troops, alongside over 100,000 British soldiers, joined together to fight against the Russians. So when it came down to helping some poor island from being butchered, let them die. Why? Because we need to maintain our strong key strategic alliance with a very strong key strategic ally, Turkey. But when it comes to fighting the Russians, absolutely, the British will use their military. They will use their means to go against Russia. And how did this war begin? How did this war begin in 1853? It's known as the Crimean War. It began because the Russians wanted to protect the Eastern Orthodox population in Palestine. Palestine at that time was under Ottoman rule. And the Russians said that we want the Eastern Orthodox population of Palestine to be under Russian protection. And the Ottomans did not like this because they saw it as an encroachment on their empire. Now, there was some sort of a deal that was made between the Russians and the Turks, but the Turks changed their mind. And once the Turks changed their mind, the Russians declared war. And the British did not hesitate to side with the Turks. What's happening right now? We have Russian Orthodox Christians being persecuted by Ukrainian nationalists, and the British are siding with the Ukrainian nationalists. And recently, the British armed the Ukrainians with depleted uranium. Now, I spent some time today looking into depleted uranium, and let me tell you, it is some very, very nasty stuff. The Americans used depleted uranium in the Gulf War and in the Second Iraq War. And because of the use of depleted uranium in the attacks on Iraq, cancer rates went up tenfold. Looking into the Gulf War, cancer rates went up tenfold because of America's use of depleted uranium. The Americans also used depleted uranium when they bombed the Serbs in the 1990s. And just like in Iraq, cancer rates went up tremendously in Serbia. Just one little particle of depleted uranium will destroy a human being's immune system. Now, are the British going to go to war with the Russians? I don't think the British are going to have a boots-on-the-ground conflict with the Russians, but the British are simply following the tendency of the Anglosphere, which is to give the burden of combat, give the burden of fighting to other people. And they're using the Ukrainians as a proxy against the Russians. This is why when a peace deal was coming very close between the Russians and the Ukrainians, Boris Johnson made a trip to Volodymyr Zelensky and told him, you better not make peace with the Russians. Why? Because the Anglosphere wants to continue this war to devastate the Russians. It's that simple. And Orthodox Christians are suffering, but it doesn't matter. Why? Because they want to maintain this war to devastate the Russians, to cripple the Russians. Just as the British did not give a damn about some poor Greeks who were butchered because they wanted to maintain their alliance with the Turks against the Russians. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.